Independence Day, July 4th, 2020. History can be a relentless teacher. Our first Independence Day was about 244 years ago, on July the 4th, 1776. A lot has happened since then. It all really started maybe 250 years ago, during a time when Great Britain was the largest superpower on Earth. It was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. The British had colonized places all over the world, and the sun never set on the British Empire. Although the New World was more than just American colonies, there were also Canadian colonies, there were even Portuguese colonies, some French colonies. But Great Britain laid claim to the American colonies. The American colonies depended on trade with Great Britain for staples, merchandise. And so, although the American colonies were a possession of the British Empire, the British Parliament would not recognize the American colonies nor give them any say in the British Parliament. They had no voting rights and they had no say in how they were governed. By the 1760s, the British government was deeply in debt. Imagine that. So, in need of cash flow, the British Parliament imposed a tax entitled the Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act imposed a tax on every piece of printed paper, from business licenses to contracts, even playing cards, and certainly the newspapers of the day. Now, for those millennials in my audience, newspaper was the method by which information was disseminated. There was really no other form. In some places, newspapers were printed on a regular basis, sometimes weekly, sometimes daily, depending on the population that would take advantage of the newspaper. And so that was the only way it got delivered, was by the printed word on a piece of paper. The news came on paper, so we called that the newspaper. The newspaper headlined the news, human interest stories, advertising from local businesses. The newspaper was the major method of sharing information, and now everybody's newspaper became heavily taxed. But that wasn't enough. A couple of years later, in 1767, the British imposed even more taxes, and this was called the Townshend Acts of 1767. And they not only increased taxes, but as the government grew, they imposed more taxes on paint, on paper, on glass, and even certain metals. The occupying British forces then were becoming more and more resented by the American colonists. As that resentment grew, on March the 5th of 1770, a street brawl took place on the streets of Boston between a few of the British soldiers and a group of unruly American colonists. And so the colonists displayed their resentment against the soldiers, at first by throwing snowballs. And then they started throwing oyster shells. And then they started throwing chunks of ice. And the crowd got out of control. British reinforcements arrived, and as the mob became totally uncontrollable, the British opened fire on the mob, ultimately killing 5 of the mobsters, as well as wounding another 6. The news media of the time called this the Boston Massacre, and it further enraged the colonists against the British. By the 1770s, the British government was even further in debt. All governments need money to survive. Governments support themselves by taxing their citizens. Tea was a very important commodity in those days. With a population of just over 2 million colonists, the colonists managed to consume over 1 million pounds of tea annually. Every year, 1 million pounds of tea. The taxes on tea then would be quite substantial. With the higher and higher taxes on tea, the colonists became more and more resentful of British rule. So, on December the 16th of 1773, at Griffin's Wharf in Boston, American colonists, led by Samuel Adams and his Sons of Liberty. Now, the Sons of Liberty were a group of colonial merchants and tradesmen, namely such patriots as Benedict Arnold, Patrick Henry, Paul Revere, John Adams, John Hancock, just to name a few. These patriots disguised themselves as indigenous American Indians, costumed, complete with costumes, long dark hair, feathered headdresses, and tomahawks. The colonists were frustrated and angry at Britain for imposing taxation without representation. So they dumped 342 chests of tea. That's over 90,000 pounds of tea, nearly 50 tons of tea, overboard into the salty waters of Boston Harbor. The tea was being imported to Boston Harbor by the British India Tea Company. The raid lasted for more than 3 hours without any violence, and random reports say that protesters left the ship, apart from throwing the tea overboard, with no property damage and no looting. During the tea party, they were surrounded by British warships, but nobody lifted a finger to stop what was going on. Before they left, the demonstrators even swept the decks clean to leave it in nice shape afterwards. The event, known as the Boston Tea Party, rallied American patriots across all 13 colonies to fight for their independence. This was the first major act of defiance to British rule for the colonists. It showed the American colonists would not take taxation and tyranny without opposition. Attempts were made to smuggle in tea, some Dutch tea, which left a further deepened hole in the taxation that Britain was looking forward to. And then, on September the 5th of 1774, delegates from most of the 13 colonies, and they were united in the patriotic success of the Boston Tea Party. They met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia for the first ever Continental Congress, and they discussed plans of how they would resist British oppression. Together, they declared their right to self-government, and they rallied other colonists to form and train a colonial militia. This militia trained to respond at a minute's notice, and this militia was then known as the Minutemen. As the tide of independence accelerated, it was just a few months later, on the 18th of April in 75, there came the shot heard round the world. It all started, as commemorated in a poem by William Wadsworth Longfellow, Paul Revere's Ride. On the 18th of April in 75, yes, that's when Paul Revere made his famous ride, and it went down in history as he rode from every Middlesex village and farm. His message was a cry of defiance and not of fear. The shot heard round the world came on the next morning in Lexington and Concord on April the 19th, 1775. We were now officially at war with Great Britain. After this, some 63 weeks later, that's about 442 days, the shot heard round the world, a declaration was drafted by Thomas Jefferson. The fathers of our country publicly declared their independence from Britain. John Hancock was the first to sign the document with his large and prominent signature. He is said to have made his signature so large and so prominent in order that King George III couldn't miss noticing it. Finally, 56 delegates from all 13 colonies signed their names to the Declaration of Independence. Each man doing so was risking his life. The signing was a treasonous act, punishable by death from the hangman's noose. The 13 former colonies were now known as the United States of America. British was the largest military force in the world. Now we were officially at war for our independence from Great Britain, a war that would last officially for more than 6 years. The French would finally enter the American Revolutionary War on the side of us colonists in 1778, and they assisted the Continental Army to force the British to surrender at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. By then, we had officially won our independence, though the fighting would not formally end until 1783. over 6 years of fighting for our independence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We are the United States of America. God bless us, everyone.